the first thing I heard was the sound of welding sparks cracking through the mountain air at midnight. And that's when I realized my HOA had made the biggest mistake of their lives. The smell of burnt steel drifted through the pine trees before I even killed my truck engine. Sharp, bitter, mixed with cold mountain air and fresh snow rolling down from the ridge above Black Pine Ridge Estates. My headlights cut across the darkness, just enough for me to see 3 men in reflective jackets standing at the entrance to my cabin road, with portable welding torches hissing like angry snakes. Orange sparks exploded against the steel gate my grandfather installed back in 1978. They were sealing it shut. I sat there for a second with both hands gripping the steering wheel, diesel engine rumbling beneath me while snowflakes melted against the windshield. 50 acres of Montana wilderness stretched behind that gate. My cabin sat another half-mile uphill beside Cedar Creek, where I'd spent every summer of my childhood learning how to split firewood and repair bridge cables with my grandfather. And now some HOA board members in luxury SUVs thought they could lock me out of my own land because my cabin supposedly didn't fit their community vision. One of the workers looked up as my headlights washed over him. He froze for a second before turning toward the woman standing beside a white Range Rover parked near the road. Victoria Hale, HOA president. Cashmere coat wrapped tight around her neck. Blonde hair perfectly styled even at midnight, like she thought the mountains worked for her personally. She stepped forward slowly, boots crunching through the snow while the welding torch behind her continued spitting sparks against my gate. "Mr. Walker," she called out with that fake polished smile rich people use right before screwing you over legally. "You've ignored multiple compliance notices. Black Pine Ridge has voted to revoke your access until further review." I rolled my window down halfway. Cold air rushed into the truck, carrying the smell of wet pine and molten metal. "You welded my gate shut?" I asked. Her smile tightened. "This road now falls under emergency community authority." The arrogance in her voice almost made me laugh right there. Almost. Because what she didn't understand was that mountain communities survive on one thing: access, roads, bridges, escape routes. And every single homeowner sitting comfortably inside those $3 million vacation lodges across the valley depended on one old timber bridge to reach the highway below. A bridge my grandfather built after the flood of 1972 wiped out the original county crossing. A bridge sitting entirely on land legally titled to me. Victoria folded her arms like she'd already won. Behind her, the welding torch screeched one final time before the worker stepped back from the gate. Thick steel chain fused permanently around the bars. "You should have cooperated, Ethan," she said calmly. "Now let's see how long you last up here." For a second, nobody moved. Snow drifted sideways through the headlights. Somewhere deeper in the trees, I could hear the creek roaring beneath ice. Then I looked past Victoria's shoulder toward the valley below, where warm golden lights glowed from every HOA cabin scattered across the mountainside. Families drinking wine beside fireplaces. Tourists sleeping peacefully in rented luxury lodges. People who had absolutely no idea the only bridge connecting them to the outside world belonged to the man standing on the wrong side of a welded gate. And right there, with the smell of burnt steel hanging in the air and welding sparks still glowing orange against the snow, I smiled for the first time all night. I stayed parked at the bottom of that welded gate for another minute after Victoria walked away. The welding crew packed their equipment into the back of a white utility truck while snow drifted across the road in thin silver waves under the headlights. Nobody looked at me anymore. That was the thing about people like Victoria Hale. The second they think they have power, they stop paying attention. The steel chain around my gate ticked softly as it cooled in the mountain air. Metal contracting against metal. I could still smell burnt iron mixing with cedar smoke from cabins farther down the valley. Black Pine Ridge always smelled expensive at night. Pinewood fireplaces, fresh snow, luxury money pretending to be wilderness. My grandfather used to hate that smell. He called it city perfume sprayed over mountain dirt. I shifted the truck into reverse and backed slowly away from the gate, while memories kept pushing into my head harder than the storm rolling over the ridge. My grandfather, Walter Walker, built that cabin with his own hands in 1974 after the county flood wiped out half the valley roads. He was one of those old Montana men who could repair diesel engines, pour concrete, and argue property law all before lunch. The cabin was never fancy. Just rough cedar walls, a cast iron stove, and a wide porch facing the mountains. But every board in that place meant something. I learned how to read blueprints sitting at his kitchen table while snowstorms rattled the windows. Learned how to weld before I could legally drive. Learned that land ownership was not about money. It was about leverage, about survival, about never depending on people who smile while planning around you. The bridge came later. Spring of 1972, Cedar Creek flooded so badly it ripped the county crossing clean off its foundations. The entire valley got trapped for 6 days. No fuel deliveries. No ambulance access. No supply trucks. My grandfather spent almost a year designing the timber bridge that eventually replaced it. I still remember standing beside him as a kid while he checked the steel tension rods underneath with a flashlight clenched between his teeth. "Control the bridge," he told me once, tightening a rusted bolt with snow falling around us. "And you control the mountain." At the time, I thought he was just talking like an old stubborn rancher. Turns out he was teaching me property warfare before I even knew what that meant. I drove down the mountain another mile before stopping beside the overlook above the valley. From there, I could see the entire Black Pine Ridge development glowing against the snow like a luxury catalog spread across the forest. Big windows, heated driveways, vacation homes with names carved into stone entrances. Aspen Lodge, Summit View, Cedar Peak Retreat. Half those people probably thought they were rugged outdoorsmen because they owned flannel shirts and drank whiskey beside propane fireplaces on weekends. Victoria had spent the last 3 years turning the valley into a playground for wealthy out-of-state buyers. She hated my cabin because it reminded people what the mountain looked like before the resort showed up. My old Ford truck, my stacked firewood, my generator humming during storms. Every inch of my property offended her carefully curated version of mountain living. And now she thought welding my gate shut proved she controlled this valley. The funny part was she had no idea how fragile her little empire really was. Because hidden under 6 inches of fresh snow and 70 years of county paperwork sat one simple truth nobody in Black Pine Ridge seemed to understand anymore. Every road in that valley eventually crossed my bridge. By sunrise, the storm had settled over the valley like a heavy gray blanket. Snow coated the roofs of Black Pine Ridge so perfectly the entire place looked fake from a distance, like one of those luxury Christmas villages people put on fireplace mantels. I parked beside Miller's General Store halfway down the mountain and stepped out into air cold enough to sting my teeth. The smell of coffee and wet pine drifted through the parking lot, while locals scraped frost-off pickup windshields with gloved hands. Nobody in this valley missed anything for long. By 7 in the morning, everybody already knew Victoria Hale had welded my gate shut. The old cashier inside gave me that careful look small-town people use when they want gossip without asking directly. "Rough night up at the Ridge?" she asked while pouring burnt coffee into a paper cup. I just nodded once. Outside, the crunch of boots against frozen gravel echoed across the lot as a black luxury SUV rolled slowly past the store windows. Victoria again. Of course. She drove through town like a queen inspecting conquered territory. White leather interior. Heated steering wheel. Probably had not touched a snow shovel in her life. The SUV slowed just enough for her to see me standing there holding coffee beside my truck. Then she smiled and drove on. That was her favorite move. The smile. Not angry. Not loud. Just calm enough to let you know she enjoyed the pressure. 3 years earlier, Black Pine Ridge had been mostly old cabins, retired ranchers, and seasonal fishing homes. Then Victoria arrived from Denver with real estate money and resort investors trailing behind her like perfume. Suddenly, every dirt road needed community improvement. Every cabin needed aesthetic compliance. Every resident became either useful or inconvenient. Guess which category I landed in? The harassment started small. It always does with people like her. One violation notice for stacked firewood visible from the road. Another because my truck leaked a few drops of oil near the driveway. Then came the generator complaints during winter storms, even though half the valley lost power every year. She once fined me $200 because smoke from my wood stove was excessively rustic. I wish I was joking. I fought every single notice with paperwork, county ordinances, inspection reports, and survey maps. Did not matter. Victoria treated HOA bylaws like royal decrees. The worst part was watching neighbors slowly stop talking to me in public. Not because they hated me, because they were scared of becoming her next target. She controlled access to contractor approvals, rental permits, landscaping requests, even snowplow schedules during winter. People learned fast that disagreeing with Victoria Hale could suddenly make life expensive. Around noon, my phone buzzed while I sat inside the truck overlooking the valley. Unknown number. I answered and immediately heard the polished voice of Martin Keller, the HOA attorney. "Mr. Walker," he began carefully, "the association would like to resolve this matter professionally." There it was. Lawyer language wrapped around intimidation. He explained that Black Pine Ridge had voted to classify my access road as shared emergency infrastructure. According to him, my gate now interfered with community safety planning. I stared through the windshield toward the mountain ridge while wind rattled dry snow across the hood. "You welded private property shut in the middle of the night," I said. Silence hummed through the phone for half a second. Then Keller lowered his voice. "Victoria believes cooperation would be in everyone's best interest." Cooperation. Funny word. Usually means surrender when rich people say it. I looked down the mountain toward the bridge hidden beneath fresh snow and pine shadows. Trucks crossed it every hour carrying propane, groceries, tourists, and construction crews into Black Pine Ridge. Nobody noticed the old steel ownership marker bolted beneath the north support beam anymore. But I remembered it. My grandfather made me polish that marker every spring as a kid until the engraved name shined bright enough to reflect sunlight. Walker Property Trust. I took another slow sip of coffee while cold wind hissed through the trees around me. Then I smiled and told the lawyer the same thing my grandfather used to say whenever somebody confused patience for weakness. "You should probably check the bridge paperwork before this gets expensive." The snow started falling harder by late afternoon, thick wet flakes slamming against the windshield while I drove the old logging road toward county records. Montana storms have a way of swallowing sound. Tires crunch softer. Wind turns heavy. Even the pine trees seem to hold their breath waiting for something bad to happen. My phone buzzed 3 times before I finally glanced at it at a stop sign. HOA violation notices. Again. Victoria had apparently decided welding my gate shut was just the beginning. The first email claimed my cabin posed a fire risk due to improper winter maintenance. The second accused me of unauthorized fuel storage because I kept diesel for my generator. The third was my favorite. Community disruption through hostile legal interference. I actually laughed out loud sitting there alone in the truck while snow hissed across the hood. Hostile legal interference. Translation, I stopped rolling over. The county administration building sat at the edge of town, looking exactly like every rural government office in America. Brown brick walls, flickering fluorescent lights, smell of burnt coffee and wet boots near the entrance. Inside, old heating vents rattled overhead while people shuffled papers behind. Scratched counters like the entire building was permanently stuck in 1986. I headed straight for land records. Nancy Ellis worked the records desk. Late 60s. Reading glasses hanging from a silver chain around her neck. She knew every property line in 3 counties and probably half the divorces too. The second she saw me, her face tightened slightly. "Ethan," she said quietly, "you picked a rough week to fight with Black Pine Ridge." I leaned against the counter while cold water dripped from my coat onto the tile floor. "Need copies of the Walker Bridge filings. Original easements too." Nancy hesitated. Just for a second. But I noticed. "Victoria's attorney was here this morning," she admitted softly. "Asked for the same documents." There it was. Finally, the smell of old paper and dust filled the tiny records room behind her as she disappeared through a metal door. I stood there listening to filing cabinets slam open somewhere deeper inside while snow hammered the windows. My grandfather always said lawyers only panic when they discover somebody else kept better records. 10 minutes later, Nancy returned carrying 3 thick folders bound with fading county seals. She lowered her voice. "Ethan, there is something strange in these updated subdivision maps." We spread the documents across a scratched wooden table beneath buzzing fluorescent lights. Survey maps, easement agreements, emergency access filings, layer after layer of legal language stretching back decades. Then I saw it. Victoria's HOA had quietly amended Black Pine Ridge infrastructure filings 8 months earlier during their expansion project. Buried deep inside the county update was one sentence that made the corners of my mouth slowly lift. Primary emergency access route dependent upon existing private bridge structure under Walker Property Trust. I read it twice just to enjoy it properly. They actually filed the bridge as essential emergency infrastructure while still assuming they controlled access to it. The arrogance was unbelievable. They never checked ownership because people like Victoria do not believe working men keep leverage. Nancy adjusted her glasses nervously. If that bridge becomes inaccessible during winter conditions, the entire subdivision becomes landlocked. I finished quietly. The heating vent rattled overhead while silence settled across the room. Every luxury cabin, every vacation rental, every propane truck, every emergency vehicle, all dependent on one timber bridge sitting on private property they had spent months harassing. Suddenly the welded gate made perfect sense. Victoria thought she could isolate me before I realized how exposed she really was. My phone buzzed again while I gathered the files. Another message from the HOA board. Final notice of access revocation. Snow pounded harder outside as daylight faded over the mountains. I slipped the bridge documents carefully into my grandfather's old leather folder and zipped my coat closed. The thick worn leather smelled faintly like engine oil and cedar wood even after all these years. Funny thing about mountains. People think the danger comes from cliffs and storms. Usually it comes from underestimating the quiet guy who knows exactly where the load-bearing beams are. The storm hit hard that night. By 10 o'clock, the entire mountain disappeared behind white sheets of wind-driven snow, and Cedar Creek below the bridge sounded louder than I had heard in years. Water crashing beneath ice. Timber supports groaning softly under freezing air. I stood beside the bridge railing with a flashlight in one hand while snow piled against my boots. The old ownership marker was still bolted beneath the north beam exactly where my grandfather left it decades ago. Walker Property Trust. The steel letters glimmered faintly under the flashlight beam through layers of frost. Funny how a little metal plate can scare rich people more than a loaded rifle ever could. My phone had not stopped buzzing for hours. HOA emails. Threats from attorneys. Automated notices demanding compliance. Victoria was escalating fast now, which told me one important thing. She finally checked the bridge paperwork. Around midnight, another message came through from Martin Keller. His polished lawyer tone was gone this time. Mr. Walker, Black Pine Ridge requests immediate discussion regarding emergency access. Cooperation. Cooperation again. Wealthy people always rediscover manners the second infrastructure becomes involved. I ignored the message and kept walking beneath the bridge with my flashlight sweeping slowly across the support beams. Structurally, the bridge was solid. My grandfather overbuilt everything like he expected the mountain itself to start lawsuits one day. 12-inch, treated timber supports. Reinforced steel tension rods. Drainage channels still clear despite the storm. But one thing did catch my eye. Fresh tire tracks leading onto the bridge from earlier that evening. Heavy truck tires. Wide enough to belong to commercial snowplow equipment. I followed the tracks uphill through the snow until my flashlight landed on deep scrape marks along the outer timber rail. Somebody had already tried forcing oversized equipment across the crossing during the storm. Probably HOA contractors rushing supplies into Black Pine Ridge before weather conditions worsened. My jaw tightened as cold wind pushed through the canyon below. That bridge had weight restrictions clearly posted since the 1980s. But people like Victoria never read warning signs. They assume money exempts them from engineering. The next morning confirmed exactly how nervous the HOA had become. I woke up in the truck parked beside Miller's General Store after barely 3 hours of sleep. Snowplows growled through town while locals stomped slush-off boots inside the diner next door. The smell of bacon grease and burnt coffee drifted across the parking lot. My windshield was buried under 6 inches of fresh snow when Sheriff Dalton pulled up beside me in his county SUV. He stepped out slowly, adjusting his winter hat against the wind. Dalton had known my grandfather for years. Solid man. Careful with his words. Victoria filed a complaint, he said immediately. Claims you are threatening critical infrastructure access. I leaned against the truck sipping stale coffee from yesterday while snow hissed across the asphalt. Did she mention welding my gate shut? Dalton rubbed his jaw uncomfortably. Ethan, this thing is turning into a mess. No, I answered calmly. It was already a mess. She just finally realized whose bridge she has been driving across. The sheriff looked tired. Real tired. County attorneys are involved now. They want everybody to stay reasonable. Reasonable. another word people use when panic starts creeping in behind expensive suits. Dalton lowered his voice slightly. Between you and me, Black Pine Ridge cannot legally operate without emergency winter access. Fire department already called the county this morning asking questions. There it was. The first crack. Small, quiet, but real. I looked past the sheriff toward the mountain road disappearing into blowing snow. Somewhere beyond those trees, Victoria Hale was probably pacing across heated hardwood floors while lawyers explained the difference between owning a subdivision and depending on someone else's bridge. The mountain wind carried the faint smell of cedar smoke down into town, while snow continued piling against rooftops and parked trucks. Winter storms have a way of exposing weak foundations. Houses, roads, people. Sooner or later, everything gets tested. The county inspection request went out at exactly 8:14 that morning, while snow still hammered the valley hard enough to erase tire tracks within minutes. I filed it from a booth inside Rosie's Diner with cold coffee sitting untouched beside my laptop and the smell of frying bacon hanging thick in the air. Structural safety concern regarding overloaded timber bridge under severe winter conditions. That was all it took. One certified engineering request from the legal owner of record. Funny how quickly people start respecting paperwork when insurance companies get nervous. Outside the diner windows, snowplows crawled through town, pushing walls of slush against parked trucks, while locals gathered around televisions mounted above the counter. Weather alerts flashed nonstop across the bottom of the screen. Winter storm warning. Avalanche risk elevated. Limited mountain travel advised. Black Pine Ridge sat directly in the center of that storm system like a glittering little island of bad decisions. Around 10 o'clock, the first luxury SUV came barreling down the mountain road toward town before stopping hard outside the diner. Victoria Hale stepped out wearing a white wool coat and sunglasses even though the sky looked like wet concrete. She moved fast across the parking lot, boots slipping slightly on packed snow while icy wind whipped through her hair. The second she walked through the diner doors, the entire room went quiet except for the hiss of the grill behind the counter. Victoria spotted me immediately. "You filed a structural complaint against the bridge?" she demanded, voice sharp enough to cut glass. I closed the laptop slowly and looked up at her. "I filed a safety inspection. You are intentionally disrupting emergency access." Interesting phrase coming from the woman who welded somebody's gate shut. Her jaw tightened. For a second I thought she might actually lose control in front of everybody. Instead, she leaned closer over the table, lowering her voice. "Expensive perfume mixed with melting snow and burnt coffee. Do you understand how many homeowners depend on that road?" I held her stare calmly. "More than you apparently." The diner stayed dead silent behind us while snow rattled against the windows. Victoria's confidence looked different up close now. Less polished, less certain, like somebody had finally explained the numbers to her. Fire liability, insurance exposure, emergency evacuation requirements. Resort developments survive on access. Without reliable bridge certification during winter conditions, Black Pine Ridge was not a luxury mountain community anymore. It was a legal nightmare trapped behind snowfall. She straightened slowly, adjusting the sleeve of her coat. "This does not end well for you, Ethan." I almost smiled at that. Almost. "You already welded my gate shut, Victoria. We passed, 3 days ago." She turned and walked out without another word, heels clicking sharply against the diner floor while every eye in the room followed her back into the storm. The second the door shut behind her, old Frank Miller behind the counter let out a low whistle. "Boy," he muttered quietly. That woman finally realized she stepped on a rake. By early afternoon, county engineers arrived at the bridge in 2 white utility trucks fitted with snow chains. I watched from the riverbank while they inspected support beams, measured load stress points, and photographed the scrape damage left by heavy contractor equipment. The wind coming off Cedar Creek carried the sharp smell of frozen water and wet timber through the canyon, while snow swirled around the bridge cables in ghostly waves. One of the engineers crouched near the damaged railing, shaking his head slowly. "Whoever pushed oversized plows across this during storm load conditions was asking for trouble," he said. "Exactly what I expected. Because bridges are like people. Ignore their limits long enough, and eventually they stop carrying weight safely." Around sunset, the county posted temporary warning signs at both ends of the crossing. "Restricted access pending safety review." bright orange against white snow. The second those signs went up, panic spread through Black Pine Ridge faster than the storm itself. Delivery trucks started turning around. Rental guests flooded the HOA hotline. Contractors canceled uphill service calls. And somewhere inside her giant heated mountain lodge, Victoria Hale was finally learning the difference between controlling appearances and controlling infrastructure. The real panic started Friday morning when the propane trucks stopped climbing the mountain. You could smell it in town before you even heard about it. Diesel exhaust hanging heavy near the highway turnoff. Delivery drivers arguing over radios. Tourists standing outside coffee shops staring at weather alerts on their phones while snow kept piling against parked vehicles. Black Pine Ridge was built to look isolated and exclusive, but the truth about isolated places is simple. They survive entirely on supply lines. Cut access for 48 hours during winter and luxury turns into inconvenience real fast. By noon my phone was ringing nonstop. Property managers, contractors, insurance representatives, even a nervous vacation rental company asking whether the bridge closure would affect guest experience obligations. I sat inside my truck parked beside Cedar Creek while all of them danced carefully around the real question. Nobody wanted to ask if I planned to reopen the bridge, because everybody already knew the answer depended on one person. Victoria Hale. The storm clouds hung low across the mountains, turning daylight gray and flat. Snowmelt dripped steadily from the old bridge beams above me, with a hollow ticking sound against frozen rocks below. Around 1 o'clock, another black SUV appeared crawling carefully down the road through slush and packed snow. This time Victoria was not alone. Martin Keller stepped out beside her carrying a leather folder thick enough to choke a horse. His polished shoes sank immediately into 6 inches of snow, and I almost laughed watching him try to maintain lawyer dignity while sliding sideways toward the bridge railing. Victoria approached first. No sunglasses today. No fake smile either. Just cold anger wrapped tightly behind exhausted eyes. "You made your point," she said sharply over the wind. I stayed leaning against the truck with my gloves tucked beneath my arms for warmth. "Have I?" Martin stepped forward quickly before she could answer. "Mr. Walker, Black Pine Ridge is prepared to discuss temporary emergency easement terms." There it was. Easement. Funny how the legal vocabulary changes once infrastructure starts choking rich neighborhoods financially. I looked past them uphill toward the subdivision hidden beyond the storm. Somewhere up there, residents were probably discovering their grocery deliveries had been canceled for the weekend. Tourists realizing snowmobiles could not be rented because fuel trucks were delayed. Wealthy homeowners suddenly understanding that mountain roads are not controlled by homeowner newsletters and passive-aggressive emails. Temporary. I repeated calmly. Your HOA welded private property shut. Victoria crossed her arms tightly against the cold. You are dragging this out intentionally. No, I answered quietly. You dragged it here the second you touched my gate. The wind pushed harder through the canyon, rattling loose ice beneath the bridge supports. Martin opened the folder, carefully protecting the papers from snowflakes. The association is willing to remove all current violations and restore your road access immediately. I stared at him for a second, then at Victoria. Neither of them understood yet. This stopped being about HOA fines days ago. They still thought this was a negotiation. It was actually a structural lesson. The county inspection is not finished, I said. And after your contractors overloaded the bridge during a winter storm, I am not authorizing unrestricted traffic until engineers clear it. Victoria's face flushed red against the freezing air. People live up there. So do I. Silence settled over the creek except for water crashing beneath the bridge. Finally, Martin lowered the folder slightly. What exactly do you want? There it was again. The shift. Not command anymore. Not threats. Need. I looked up at the old timber beams overhead where snow clung thick along the railings my grandfather built 50 years earlier. Then I looked directly at Victoria Hale. First, I said slowly, you remove every chain and weld from my gate by sunset. Second, your HOA signs a permanent easement agreement recognizing the Walker Property Trust as sole bridge owner. Third, every violation notice against my cabin disappears permanently. Victoria opened her mouth immediately, but Martin stopped her with one raised hand. Smart man. He finally understood something she still did not. In the mountains, ownership is not about who talks the loudest. It is about who controls the road home. By sunset, the storm finally began breaking apart over the valley. Thick gray clouds split open just enough for strips of cold orange light to spill across the snow-covered rooftops of Black Pine Ridge. The mountain looked peaceful again from a distance. Quiet, expensive, controlled. But underneath that polished vacation town image, panic was spreading fast. I could feel it everywhere. Contractors speeding downhill before dark. Residents calling county offices demanding updates. Snowplows idling beside blocked service roads while delivery drivers smoked cigarettes in frustration near the highway turnoff. The whole subdivision suddenly moved like a machine running low on oxygen. I parked near the entrance to my cabin road just before 6 o'clock. The welded chain still hung across the gate exactly where Victoria's crew left it. 3 nights earlier, black scorch marks staining the steel bars beneath fresh snow. The smell of burnt metal still lingered faintly whenever the wind shifted downhill. 10 minutes later, headlights appeared through the trees. 3 HOA utility trucks rolled slowly toward the gate, followed by Victoria's white Range Rover and a county inspection vehicle behind it. Nobody spoke much when they stepped out into the freezing evening air. The only sounds came from idling diesel engines and the soft hiss of wind moving through pine branches overhead. Victoria looked exhausted now. Not angry, just worn down the way people look after reality finally stops negotiating with them. One of the HOA workers unloaded an oxyacetylene torch from the truck bed, while another dragged extension cables through the snow. The county inspector stood nearby with his clipboard watching everything carefully. Smart move. Nobody trusted anybody anymore. I stayed beside my truck with my hands buried inside my coat pockets while the workers lit the torch. Blue flame erupted against the growing darkness with a sharp metallic hiss. Then sparks exploded across the gate exactly like they had the night Victoria sealed it shut. Funny how karma-like symmetry. The steel chain glowed bright orange beneath the torch while melted snow steamed around the hinges. Nobody talked. Nobody joked. Even Victoria stayed silent, watching her own workers cut apart the mess she created. The sound of metal snapping loose echoed across the canyon louder than I expected. One heavy section of chain dropped into the snow with a dull frozen thud. Just like that, my gate swung open again. The county inspector scribbled something onto his clipboard before walking toward me through the snow. "Mr. Walker," he said carefully, "temporary bridge access restrictions remain in place, pending final reinforcement approval. But your private road access is fully restored effective immediately." I nodded once. Professional. Calm. But inside, I could almost hear my grandfather laughing somewhere in the back of my head. Victoria finally stepped toward me after the workers packed away the torch equipment. Her expensive boots sank slightly into slush near the gate while wind tugged loose strands of hair across her face. "The HOA board agreed to your easement terms," she said quietly. "No performance left now. No suburban queen act. Just a tired woman standing in freezing snow realizing money does not rewrite property law." Martin Keller handed me a thick envelope containing signed documents. Permanent easement recognition. Full withdrawal of all violations. Formal acknowledgement of Walker Property Trust ownership over the bridge and surrounding structural access corridors. Every signature exactly where it needed to be. I tucked the envelope beneath my arm while snow drifted softly around us beneath fading twilight. Then Victoria looked past me up the long road leading toward my cabin hidden deeper in the trees. "You could have destroyed this entire community if you wanted to," she said. I looked back toward the bridge far below where headlights crawled slowly through the canyon under fresh warning signs and county barricades. Cedar Creek roared beneath the timbers exactly like it had when my grandfather first built the crossing half a century earlier. "No," I answered calmly. "I just wanted you to remember whose mountain you moved onto." The wind carried the smell of pine smoke downhill while the last of the welding sparks faded into the snow. Spring arrived slowly in the mountains that year. Snow melted off the rooftops of Black Pine Ridge in uneven patches, while Cedar Creek swelled beneath the bridge carrying broken ice chunks downstream like shattered glass. The whole valley smelled different once winter loosened its grip. Wet pine, mud, fresh cedar bark warming under sunlight. After months of cold tension and frozen roads, even the wind sounded softer moving through the canyon. I spent most mornings rebuilding sections of the old bridge railing damaged by overloaded snowplows during the storm. Hammer strikes echoed through the valley while sunlight filtered between the trees and fresh sawdust collected across my boots. My grandfather used to say spring repairs tell you everything about how people treated a structure during winter. Looking at those scrape marks and cracked side rails, I already knew exactly how Black Pine Ridge handled pressure. The HOA board changed fast after the easement agreement. Funny how quickly community leadership disappears once lawyers and insurance companies start asking hard questions. Victoria Hale officially resigned 2 weeks after the county finalized bridge access documents. The rumor around town was that several homeowners threatened legal action against the HOA after learning about the unauthorized gate closure and the hidden infrastructure filings. Turns out wealthy people do not enjoy discovering their multi-million-dollar vacation homes almost became inaccessible during a blizzard because somebody wanted to bully a cabin owner. Martin Keller handled most of the fallout quietly after that. Smart man. He understood damage control. The violation notices against my property vanished permanently. HOA enforcement policies suddenly became under review. Even the neighborhood newsletters changed tone overnight. Gone were the passive-aggressive reminders about aesthetics and compliance. Now everything talked about community cooperation and respect for legacy landowners. Amazing what a little structural leverage does to suburban attitudes. One afternoon near the end of April, I drove uphill toward my cabin with the windows rolled down for the first time in months. Meltwater trickled through roadside ditches while sunlight flashed across wet pine needles along the mountain road. The gate stood fully repaired at the entrance to my property, fresh steel hinges glinting beneath a new coat of black paint. No chains, no weld marks, just quiet mountain air and the soft creak of timber moving in the breeze. I stopped the truck beside the bridge before heading home. The water below roared louder now from spring runoff, crashing against the support beams my grandfather poured with his own hands half a century earlier. Mounted beside the north railing sat a brand new cedar sign, carved deep enough to survive another 50 winters. Walker Bridge. Private property. Respect goes both ways. The letters caught sunlight perfectly against the dark wood grain. I stood there for a while listening to the creak and breathing in the smell of wet cedar drifting up from the canyon below. Then I heard tires crunching slowly across gravel behind me. A moving truck. White. Out-of-state plates. It crawled carefully downhill past the bridge, followed by Victoria Hale's Range Rover loaded with cardboard boxes and suitcases stacked high against the back windows. She slowed briefly near the crossing, but never rolled down the window. Never looked at me either. Probably easier that way. The SUV continued toward the highway, disappearing beyond the trees